Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are just waiting for another counselor to join us, and then we will have quorum and start moving. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We can begin now that Councillor Hensby has arrived. Good to see you, Councillor. Appreciate it. So good morning. Thank you for being here today for the Executive Standing Committee, May 30th. We'll start the clock here at 3 minutes after 10 and call the meeting to order. I would like to acknowledge that Halifax Regional Municipality is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. The municipality acknowledges the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory and recognizes that we are all treaty people. Thank you for being here again. I just wanted to acknowledge that I am not Mayor Mike Savage. He sends his regrets today. As Deputy Mayor, I will be here in his stead. Okay, we're just going to take 5 minutes. I apologize for that, and we'll be back in session. We just actually do not have quorum at this time. My apologies. It's a little bit like Groundhog Day, false start. No problem at all. We actually have quorum, and thank you so much for double checking with with that. So we may proceed. So I will just acknowledge that everyone here, we have Morse, Councillor Blackburn, Councillor Hensby, myself, and two guests, Councillor Mancini and Councillor Mason. Thank you so much. No? Oh, you are? Well, thank you. Okay. He's the guest. Excellent. Okay, folks, let's move on to the approval of our minutes from April 25th, please.
Move. Second.
Question has been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Moving on, approval of the order of business, please, and approval of additions and deletions. Mr. Clerk, do we have any additions or deletions? Oh, so, Madam Clerk.
There are no additions or deletions.
Thank you. Can I have a motion, please, to approve the order of business? Thank you. Thank you. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed? That motion is carried. Moving on to business arising out of the minutes. I see none. Call for declaration of conflicts of interests. I see none. Motions of rescission, none. Motions of reconsideration, none. Consideration of deferred business, none. Notices of tabled matters, there are none today. Moving on to correspondence, petitions, and delegations. Madam Clerk, sorry.
No correspondence has been received.
Wonderful, thank you.
As well as no petitions.
There have been no petitions. Excellent. Councillors, do you have any petitions? No, for today. Presentations, we have none. Moving on to information items brought forward. Number 11, we have none. So let's get to our staff report. 12.1.1, the 2022 District Boundary Review, the Phase 1 recommendation. I believe we have a presentation from Mr. Clerk. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for
allowing us to come to your meeting today. Appreciate that. And wanted to start off by doing some brief introductions. Joined with me this morning is Liam McSween, who is our Manager of Elections and Special Projects, as well as Margaret Chapman, who is with Narrative Research, who will be providing some information on the survey and the public engagement that was completed for Phase 1 of the District Boundary Review. So I just want to start off by acknowledging and saying that this review, the survey, all these components occurred throughout the year from January until now. We had a number of community events, community consultations, public meetings that you attended with your community council meetings. We also did run a survey as well that provided a significant amount of information on this review. I do want to note and I do want to acknowledge that throughout this survey and through the public consultation, there was a number of different health orders and things that adjusted throughout the process due to COVID that were responded to and were responsive throughout this public consultation. I do want to acknowledge the work that was done by the team and the staff to ensure this could be done when we did have a few wild cards thrown at us. We have a brief presentation. It'll go over the survey. It'll go over the analysis of the survey and some of the other information that has been provided over the last few months. And then we are available for questions. So next slide, please. So most of you have seen this slide before, probably a few times. So we are here today to speak to Phase 1 of the 2022 District Boundary Review. This is a legislative process that is required by the province of Nova Scotia. It must occur every 8 years. The next full district boundary review will occur in 2030 if there are no legislative changes. Phase 1 requires council to consider the desired number of districts for the HRM. This process requires an application or a submission to the Nova Scotia Utility Review Board, and they are the decision makers on these actions for Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 2, which is a process that we are currently in as well, looks at the actual borders of these districts. It looks at where these districts are, and it must occur after and through the recommendation from Phase 1. We have started the Phase 2 process, but the direction today will inspire the rest of the work for Phase 2 of the project. I will speak very briefly to our process, and then I will pass it over to Margaret, who will talk about the survey, and Liam will talk about some next steps after that. Phase 1 process was approved by Executive Standing Committee, and it involved a two-step process that looks at the number of districts and the boundaries that I've just alluded to. The public engagement process occurred from February 28th through March 28th, and April 9th to May 4th, sorry, Margaret. And the submission is being brought to you today as a report of Phase 1. The public consultation involved an online survey developed by Narrative Research, public information meetings hosted by community councils, and included correspondence and that came to Executive Standing Committee, community councils, and through into the to the District Boundary website as well. Through this process, interviews were completed with members of council, but I will start and pass over to Margaret's presentation, who will go over the survey, and then Liam will take over and talk about the rest of this process.
Is it working?
No.
It's not working.
Just wait. If we get Margaret's mic turned on and mine off, that'd be great.
It looks like it's on. It's on now. Great. Good morning, and thank you very much for having me here today. So I'll go over some very high-level results from the 3 phases of the research. And there's a more detailed report, which I believe has been circulated as well, if you want to dig into any of the results in more depth. So we'll start off just with a brief overview of the methodology. So I did interviews with all of you and all of your colleagues on council. So 17 in-depth interviews, and we did those between April 14th and May 4th. They all lasted about a half an hour, but up to an hour, depending on how much discussion we had. And then on the right, you can see the various elements of the quantitative survey. So we did an online survey that was open, publicly posted on the HRM website that was open to any resident aged 14 and older. And on top of that, we did a survey with our Gen Pop panel of people living in HRM. And we did that 2-phased approach of sampling members of the public on purpose. We wanted to make sure that we got a broad section of people from our panel that represents demographics across age, parts of the municipality and so forth, just to have kind of a guaranteed minimum. And then we opened it up to the general public, and we received almost 1,200 submissions, about 400 on our panel, and then about 700 on the public portal. I will say that the people that completed the survey by coming to the HRM website and doing the survey that way, when we asked about various levels of engagement about civic issues, they were more engaged, and that's not surprising. They actively came to take part, and they were more accurate about knowing how many people were on council. So not surprising there. It took about 16 minutes for people to do the survey on average, and we were basically in field for the bulk of April. And then, as Ian mentioned, we also had various submissions from community council meetings. They're summarized in the report, as well as emails and various other inputs from members of the public, which are also summarized in the report. On the next slide, it's very tiny on that screen, but in the full report, you can dig into it. The broad takeaway from this slide is just a demographic overview of who we talked to in the online survey. And it's more just of a reassurance that we talked to people across age groups. We heard from people with disabilities. We heard from people of various genders. We heard from people who have own their home and people who rent their home. We heard from people who are more engaged with council and municipal issues and have attended meetings, and then lots of people as well who haven't and have never contacted their councillor or attended meetings. So we had a really good cross-section of people across all parts of the survey. The next slide is just a very three-point summary of the key findings that we found across all three parts of this research. So residents, when we looked at, are you aware of all of these things that the council is responsible for, they are largely aware of what council does, and they feel that they know how to reach their councillor if they do have a question or issue. Over half of them also feel that their councillor is responsive to the needs of their community. And online access to council and committee meetings did increase accessibility and resident participation. We know that because we asked, had you attended a public meeting before? They were available online, and then if they hadn't, we asked about whether they attended online. So it seems to be something that people are looking for and participating that way, some people. Turning to kind of the key question of what we were asking about, and that's the number of councillors. The majority of councillors told me that the 16 councillors that are currently on council adequately represent and are effective at representing residents of the municipality, and over half of members of the general public feel that way as well. Most also told us that the current governance structure is generally perceived to be effective. So we showed people a lot of background information and then asked them what they felt about how effective that was at representing people and their views. And most people do feel that the current structure is working. Not everybody's happy, of course, and it's, as people working in municipal politics, I'm sure you're aware that not 100% of people are happy all the time. So we will dig into where there are divided views, of course. We looked at, as well as the 5 proposed criteria for determining district boundaries, and those 5 criteria, communities of interest, relative parity of voting power, geography, population density, and number of electors, are all felt to be of high importance to residents. So, you know, how important are these in determining districts? The majority of people said yes, those are all important. And councillors also agreed generally. There's a little bit of difference of opinion in that residents were less likely to rate geography as highly important compared to what I heard from councillors as a key impact, you know, driving across larger districts and the importance of geography in determining where the district sits. Importantly, councillors generally told me that the number of residents should be considered as opposed to the number of electors within a district, as I heard, I'm pretty sure unanimously, that you serve all of the people living in your district, whether they're children or new residents who are not eligible to vote and so forth, that the community is the community, not just the people who vote, and certainly not the people who are just eligible to vote. So I will dig into that a little bit as well. And importantly, those 5 criteria are felt to be a little bit vague and needing a bit more definition to really be truly understood and how they're going to be applicable in determining districts. So exactly what those terms mean is felt to be a little bit, sorry, I'm moving my hands to indicate what that means, a little bit vague, I guess is a good word for it. Okay, so we'll turn to the survey results. And just to keep today's presentation quite short, I'm showing you some very high-level results for the survey, and at a few points I've got a note about what I heard from councillors on the same issue. Now, when we designed this survey, we purposefully made it such that we asked both unaided questions, and then we filled in the blanks and gave background information to residents as we asked about their views on the number of councillors representing the municipality. So the first slide here is showing you unaided views, just absolutely without any extra information, to the best of your knowledge, how many municipal councillors make up Halifax Regional Council. Throughout these results, where you see the green line, that's going to be our panel's results, and the teal line is showing you members of the general public who, again, were a little bit more engaged. You can see that members of the general public who came to the HRM website to do the survey were more likely to be correct. 42% of them correctly, unaided said 16, and 25% of our panel said 16. But on average, when we group them all together, the average guess at how many councillors there are was about right, 16.2 or 16.4. So generally, there's a baseline knowledge about how many councillors there are. Turning to the next slide, we asked people, we told them that there are in fact 16 who collectively serve approximately 440,000 residents of the municipality. And then we said, without any more information based on what you know or have heard, which best represents your view on the current number of councillors? Is it the right amount? So this is like a Goldilocks question. Too many or too few? And members of our panel, generally, when we told them that there's 16, said, that's the right amount. 52% of them said that. And then the people who were a little more engaged, who came to the site to do the survey, 29% of them said too many, and 16% of our panel said there were too many. And under 2 in 10 said that there were too few. Some people said they weren't sure, needed some more information. So then we asked a follow-up question for anybody who said too many or too few, well, how many should there be then? And if they said too many, on average, they said there should be about 10. And if they said too few, on average, they said there should be somewhere between 23 and 26. When we combine those all together, the average comes out at roughly 16. So you can see in the top combined mean, the scores are between 15 and 17. So it kind of nets out at around 16. Next, we asked to what extent people disagreed or agreed that Halifax Regional Council, with its 16 councillors, adequately represents residents. And you can see that people are generally, there's more people on the left-hand side of this graph, mostly agreeing that the number represents residents than disagreeing. So on our panel, they were more likely to agree, 59% agreed, and the general public who came to the site to do the survey was about half and half. 45% said they agreed and 45% disagreed. And the qualitative interviews with councillors and the mayor generally agreed that the current number of councillors is appropriate to represent residents. If we turn to the next slide, we asked people why they agreed and why they disagreed. And we asked this question of agreed, whether they completely or mostly agreed. And if they agreed that council represents residents, they basically said, it's working. So it's a lack of issues, things are going along fine. So about half of people told us that. Underneath that, on the left-hand side, you're going to see a whole bunch of negative reasons that don't look like it's working. And that tends to be when people say that I mostly agree that it's working. Here are the reasons that I don't completely agree. And they mirror the reasons that people disagreed that the council adequately represents residents. So some people on that side told us that some districts are too big and that smaller communities within those districts are not well represented. Some people said that council or councillors don't listen to what people actually want. Some people told us that council is ineffective and problems aren't being resolved. Other people told us there's too many councillors and there's not a need for that many without giving us many more reasons than that. And there was also a few comments. Again, this is the proportion of disagree people, and there's only about 200 of them. But about 10% of them told us that there's a lack of diversity and there's a need for more opinions to be represented on council. Next, we asked for another view with some more information. We gave them a whole bunch of comparative cities and the number of residents in those cities and how many councillors they have. And then we said, seeing those comparisons, which best represents your view? Do we have the right number? Again, this Goldilocks question. Do we have the right number, too many or too few? And people generally told us that we have the right number when we're giving them more information about comparative municipalities and cities throughout Canada. Some people more likely to be on the engaged folks who came to the site. 30% of them said there's too many councillors, and 19% said too few. If we move on to the next slide, we asked people about the number of residents within each district, and they were told the councillors on the council each represent a range of 20,000 to 31,000 residents. And we made note of the fact that that is residents and not just electors. And we asked, is that the right number of residents to be representing or not? And the bulk of people told us that currently the right number of residents is represented by councillors. And qualitative interviews with council members also generally agreed. People feel that they are able to adequately represent their constituencies, their district, though I will note that the raw number of residents was very strongly felt not to be the only criteria or factor, that the diversity of needs within a district, the number of issues, the growth within a district, and the diversity in types of communities as well as geography should also be considered. So just looking at the raw number of residents should not be the only thing that we take a look at in determining districts. Next, we took a look at the comparative number of residents or electors within a region and how that compares to MLAs. And we asked people whether councillors should represent more electors, they're currently representing the right number, or currently representing, or they should represent fewer. And again, most people, or at least half, kind of sit in the middle and say it's about right as it is, even in comparison to the MLA's areas. Next, we took a look at the governance structure, and we had a little graph and a description that included the standing committees, the advisory boards, committees, commissions, the community councils, as well as regional council. And we asked people to what extent they agreed or disagreed that that structure of governance adequately represent residents. And you can see, again, generally people were more likely to agree that the governance structure works than they were likely to disagree. And there's about a quarter of people who said they're not sure. They had no opinion or they needed more information. And then next, I'll just walk you through the 5 criteria in determining how districts are divided and the relative importance of those. So we've got this divided up as the darker colors being people who feel that those criteria are important, and the very light colors being less important or not important at all. And the gray bar is people who are not sure whether that should be something that's included in the determination or not. And you can see from the kind of summation of importance that most people feel that all 5 of those criteria are important, and there's a little bit less importance placed on geography, as I mentioned at the outset, and population density, at least among our general population group. It's a little less likely, but still the majority of people feel all 5 of those are important. And councillors feel that those criteria, as I mentioned, need to be further defined, but really do feel that communities of interest and geography are most important. Communities of interest, I will say, is defined in different ways by different people and can the wide definition that we actually used in the survey and I believe was given to us by the UARB is quite all-encompassing. It can mean almost anything, communities of interest, but it can mean where historic communities have existed and groups of people who have common interests and common issues. And there was a very strong feeling, particularly among council members, that communities that have historically been a group and have very common interests should not be divided between districts. It makes it very difficult to kind of deal with issues. So that was a very common thread that I heard. The last slide is just a very tiny on that screen infographic that sums up all of the results, or at least the most important ones. And I think we've talked about all of them. The only one that I haven't addressed is on the left there, which is awareness of council's responsibilities. And we went through from garbage collection to infrastructure, recreation services, public transit, and so forth. And most people are aware of council's responsibilities across all of those areas, with the exception of diversity and inclusion services, where it's still half that are aware, up to 2/3, but it is a little lower than some of the other areas. Sorry, the last thing I will just mention on the right-hand side is the percentage of people who agree that they know how to reach their counselor if they do have a question or issue. And I think that's very positive to see that there's people know where to go if they do have that question. So 89% of general population and 79% of our panel said they know where to go. And over half said their counselor is responsive to the needs of their community. So that's a very short snapshot, and again, there's a lot more details in the full report.
And thank you very much, Margaret. I'm going to just take us through the rest of the presentation, staff presentation. So Margaret had taken us through the qualitative interviews conducted by Narrative Research on phase 1. I just wanted to highlight some of the additional information included by staff within the report regarding counselor workload, one of the criteria that we wanted to address in a past decision by the UARB. So numbers of, we provided information relative to the number of meetings from fiscal 2018 to 2021. And this is council meetings, standing committees, business of council. And you'll note the charts in the report, but it totals at 742 for that 4-year snapshot. It included that with that is the number of reports considered from 2018 to 2021. There's a full breakdown in the report, but also it totals 1,219 reports considered by council. And again, this is the business of council. It's not the constituency work and community associations and all those types of things, but it's just to provide a picture of overall councillor workload in terms of what members of council do on a regular basis. Councillor Support Office also completed a survey on reported daily activities. And so this just includes some of the information relative to councillor time spending outside of formal meetings of regional council. So the Councillor Support Office is reporting, based on a survey of councillors, self-reported spending an average of 3.62 hours a day on email, 1.3 hours a day on phone calls, 1.72 hours a day on social media and responding to social media, 2.41 hours a day on research. On average, councillors report being involved in 6 additional community groups beyond HRM committees, so this is some of that outside work that we're talking about. Councillors spend an average of 7 hours preparing for council meetings, and 2.7 hours preparing for community council, 2.87 hours preparing for standing committees, and 3.125 hours preparing for other boards and committees per week. And travel, of course, varied per district. So the next slide just looks at the number of polling districts and councillors, some of the findings that we found in the report. The public submission on the number of districts in the What We Heard report supports a recommendation of 16 districts within the HRM. This recommendation is supported by the data provided on current and projected populations for HRM and a jurisdictional scan of comparable Canadian cities on representation. One thing that we should note here is that we are in a very significant population growth in HRM. So there's rapid increase in HRM's populations, which will have an impact on future boundary review studies. So included in the report, there is a chart provided by our Planning and Development Department as part of the regional plan review, which provides scenarios, some growth scenarios for the next couple of years out to 2050. You can see that it ranges from low to high is the terminology that they used, and those numbers are quite striking. So one of the things that we really want to convey here is that this needs to be monitored closely because population is growing and HRM is growing district by district. So the next slide takes us through the governance structure. Information on HRM's current governance structure informed the survey and the community council presentation. Residents were asked whether the existing governance structure is accessible, allows for effective decision-making and representation for residents in their districts. It only focused on the current governance structure and did not examine individual committees, so it's that broad overview. The feedback in the What We Heard report does not support changes to the current governance structure at this time, so we're not recommending any changes to the governance structure at the present time. And I'm going to turn it over to Ian to speak to you a little bit about electoral reform items.
Thank you, Liam. This is a lengthy presentation. We will almost finish it. This is a significant amount of information we're trying to convey, so apologies for length of presentation. Throughout this project, in the survey and in the public information presentations, feedback was put forward on some of the other items that are facing the community and some of the electoral reform items. This Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the 2022 District Boundary Review needs to look at what the NSUARB has jurisdiction over, and that is what needs to be a part of the application. That does not mean that we are not going to take this information and try to provide a path forward for it. What we have found is that in the past, some of these items have been brought forward, but have not been given formal direction. So you will note in here, we have tried to look at these items and provide a path forward through some staff reports that will look at how we could move forward to look at some potential changes to legislation or what council sees fit. So these, the next slide please, some of the items that I've identified are inclusion of designated or protected seats for specific groups within the HRM. That could be an African Nova Scotian seat, Francophone seat, other options as well. Looking at the voting age, extending voting and candidacy to line of immigrants or new Canadians, ranked or runoff ballots, and adding permanent residents to the list of electors. These are some of the items that were brought up through this process. And again, as I said, there is a path forward for how these could be looked at and through a staff board process. We have a couple very brief slides on next steps, and then we'll wrap up and have time for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just run through the next steps in terms of the rest of the process. So pending on the discussion that happens today in this chamber, the Executive Standing Committee will consider the report on Phase 1, and a recommendation will be forwarded to Halifax Regional Council for its meeting on June 14th of 2022. Phase 2 has already begun, but it begins with a decision on Phase 1, and it will look at reviewing the distribution of polling districts within HRM in accordance with Section 368(4) of the Municipal Government Act. And it's important to note that this will be led by the District Boundary Review panel, who will be doing the public engagement activities and overseeing Phase 2 of the study. Public consultation activities for Phase 2 will commence in September 2022. A final report from the resident panel to the Executive Standing Committee on Phase 2 must be submitted to the Executive Standing Committee by November the 28th, 2022. and consideration of the Phase 2 findings and the executive's recommendation will be undertaken by Regional Council in December of this year. Submission of the district boundary review application to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board needs to be complete by December the 31st. And after that point, the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board will hold public hearings on the HRM boundary review application in early 2023 and render its decision with respect to the size of council and the distribution of the polling boundaries. So with that, staff are recommending that the Executive Standing Committee recommend that Halifax Regional Council confirm the number of polling districts and the number of councillors at 16 to be applied to Phase 2 of the 2022 District Boundary Review, and direct the Chief Administrative Officer to return to Council with a report on the potential electoral reforms set out in the body of this report, including any necessary legislative amendments. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Ian, Margaret, Liam. I think the length of your presentation is a good indication of how important this is for the 2024 election and for the representation of the citizens in HRM. So thank you so much for that. I will now go to our speakers list, and Councillor Wade Mason, you're up.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll put the motion on the floor. I move that the Executive Standing Committee recommend that Halifax Regional Council, 1, confirm the number of polling districts and the number of councillors at 16 and direct this to be applied to Phase 2 of the 2022 District Boundary Review, and 2, direct the Chief Administrative Officer to return to Council with a report on potential electoral reforms set out in the body of this report, including any necessary legislative amendments. I so move. Very good. So thank you so much for this. I think, are the young people behind you, Margaret, your staff? Yeah, because they were laughing because when you started talking about geography, I was like, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Because, you know, it's elementary public administration that when you create a service provision district, that people start to think of it as a polity, right? That is some kind of community. But it's the nature of the game when you're talking about a community of 220, a municipality of 220 communities, that you're going to, you know, end up with political districts that are kind of functional and aren't really like historic communities and aren't necessarily cohesive, though we have to do the best we can in terms of communities of interest. I was really glad to hear that, you know I raised the issue that historic Black communities are tended to have been split by the Utility Review Board in 2012. Glad to hear others did. You know, and I agree with all the recommendations. I don't have any strong changes because my understanding is that second part of the report there on potential electoral reforms. So I don't need to make a motion right now around First Nations. I don't have to make a motion right now about ranked ballot. Like you've heard those things from the public, and that comes in the next phase. There's general nodding from the clerk and the coordinator over there. So I'm glad to hear that. We've heard very strongly. We've been doing a lot of engagement for the last year and a half around the Cultural Heritage Priorities Plan for HRM with First Nations. And we were out there doing it again last week. And certainly that's something we hear over and over again is how do we ensure more First Nations representation on council. And it's interesting because, you know, a lot of people don't know that that legislation has existed in the legislature in Nova Scotia for 25 years. There is a, when the not for council, but for the legislature, the House of Assembly, that when there is an agreement and they feel ready that the First Nations at the Mi'kmaq can come forward and claim a seat in the House. And we're not there yet, but we may be there municipally, because certainly I hear it a lot when we go out to the bands and grand councils and consult with the other groups. So excited to hear that's moving forward. And my last two notes, other than asking the committee to support the recommendation, is on population and workload. I sure hope the UARB or you know, what I feel happened last time, and it was different times, but in 2011, 2012, the Utility Review Board and Council didn't anticipate we'd have rapid changes in population, and now that's just kind of a fact. Whether it will continue, time will tell, but I think it makes the argument for why the different districts should have a population that is relatively close, because it's 10 years of change at a relatively rapid time. You know, if you have an average of 16 or 20,000, some are going to shrink, though honestly, when you look at the census material that just dropped for 2021, nothing shrank, everything grew. It's just a matter of what grew faster, right? So I think that, you know, to put it quite plainly, there were some rural districts that I think the thinking of the Utility Review Board at the time was that's where the growth is, and we want to protect those communities, and they have the smallest population, and the growth wasn't there historically for the last 10 years, and now the differential is even larger between urban, suburban, and rural. So I think that's a concern. The other one is on the workload information that you captured from staff through the Council Support Office. I would ask the clerk to ensure that there's a page on that in whatever material we give candidates in the next election, because now that we're starting to capture that, and I'm seeing some nods from some of the newest councillors, is like, people need fair warning about what they're getting into, and I think it's great that we captured that information, because I think that can be used, I was going to say recruitment, but it's not precisely that. But anyway, thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you, staff, and thank you to Narrative.
Thank you, Councillor Mason. Councillor Tony Mancini. Oh,
Committee member first.
No.
sorry.
The rules
There-
don't require that.
There wasn't a question, but I should say welcome to Councillor Trish Purdy. Thank you for joining us today, Councillor Mancini.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the work leading up to today. You know, I was glad to hear in the presentation the work that you did here. You listened about districts that need to be involved in communities. I think our federal colleagues are struggling with that right now. If you've seen what they're proposing is disastrous, I think, how they're dividing up those boundaries. So communities are extremely important. Glad to hear there was conversations with more than just electors, and then conversations with permanent residents as an example, and those that are not old enough to vote. The 5 criteria, just clarified, did those 5 criteria come from the URAB?
Yes, those are the 5 criteria that must be followed as to the province's process.
And those are the same 5 criteria the last time we did it?
Yes, they have not changed.
So they just dusted off an old file folder and said, do the same?
The criteria for the review has not changed since the last one.
Man, oh man. That's the scary part of this whole process, because I don't know how much the IRB knows what the heck they're talking about when it comes to this discussion that we're having right now. It's concerning to me, and we saw that quite evident last time they did this. Where do I go next? Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. So my question is more about the next steps. I realize we started phase 2 and working on that, and I support the recommendation that's brought forward here today. But you know, how much weight does what your committee brings forward to the URAB? I mean, you know, is there a weighting, or do they say, yeah, that's great, but what direction are they giving you? What, you know, it's, you know, is this work for naught? Are they going to carry on their own way of doing it? Do you have any sense of what weighting they're going to give this work?
Thank you, Councillor Mancini, through the chair to yourself. In preparation for the 2022 district boundary review, one of the first and most important steps was to look at the decisions from previous district boundary reviews and apply some of the lessons learned from the legislative decision that occurred, and administratively some of the lessons learned that were recorded. So what we have done is provided and suggested a process that should reflect the recommendations that came from the previous major review, which occurred in 2010, 11, and 12. So when we looked at the staff review, the citizen review panel for phase 2, when we looked at how we framed the consultation for phase 1, that was in response to what came from the NSU-ARB. So the hope and the intent is that while the parameters of the review may not have changed, the process that we are following should hit and deal with the recommendations that came, so that we can hopefully move forward in a very positive approach.
Well, we're glad to hear that, Ian. That's fantastic. That's it, Deputy Mayor. Thank you. I do support the motion that's on the floor, even though I can't vote for it, but I support it when it comes to council. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mancini. Councillor Hensby.
Thank you much, Madam Chair, Deputy Mayor. I'd like to also acknowledge in the presence of the gallery a shadowy figure. We've been around these chambers a long time. Russell Walker, welcome back. Just a couple comments. Just kind of curiosity, was there any discussion about looking at the similarities of the provincial boundaries to the municipal boundaries? In Ontario, federal and provincial boundaries are identical. But I was wondering if there's the possibility of looking at the possibility of perhaps our municipal and provincial boundaries could be as identical as possible within the HRM boundary. I know there are some areas of overlap, Musqueam Valley or St. Margaret's Bay, but we can always adjust accordingly. But I was kind of curious of the number of seats that would create. Would that be like 21 seats versus our 16 now? I'm just kind of curious of the potential of pairing the municipal provincial boundaries.
Thank you, Councillor Hensby, through the chair to yourself. So there are 21 provincial seats incorporating around the HRM. So the number and the borders do not meet the HRM borders, from my understanding. So we have looked at some representation numbers on that. For phase 2, that can be an element that the citizen review panel may choose to look at when they're looking at the different boundaries and how those boundaries could be the same. But that was not, the actual boundaries themselves was not looked at for phase 1, but for phase 2 it might be an element. Like I said, the numbers themselves wouldn't match because there's 21 and there is a recommendation moving forward of 16 right now.
Okay, and just to remind folks, back in 2012, when the boundaries were last reviewed, it was the communities of Sherbrooke, Lake Loon asked to be separated from the east and North Preston. They want to be part of the Cole Harbour Westfall community. Historically, as that was their relationship over the years. So the splitting of the black communities was at the request of the communities and not by the URB at the time. Also, just the other question would be in regards to boundaries themselves. So we're sticking with 16, but I assume there's going to be an opportunity for slight adjustments for those nuances. I think Councillor Mancini can talk about one in their area, Dartmouth East. I could talk a part about Westfall, Little Salmon River. They're just ways that they should be perhaps modified to bring communities collectively together. So I was wondering if that will be an opportunity to be assessed in the near future.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and through you to the councillor. Absolutely, that'll be like a fundamental part of phase 2 of the study. We'll be looking at the actual physical boundaries and factoring in communities of interest and those criteria from the Municipal Government Act. So that'll be and the District Boundary Resident Review Panel will be leading the public engagement activities for those on those exercises.
And I will note that the District Boundary Panel's first formal meeting will be happening this Wednesday, virtually at 3:30. And there is public participation at every single District Boundary Resident Review Panel meeting, which is also a plug for this group and for this for the public as well. So that process has begun, and their first meeting will be this Wednesday.
And how accurate do you have the latest census data in regards to how much can you drill down to local community boundaries or neighborhoods?
Staff are currently, thank you, Madam Chair, through you to the councillor. Staff are currently assessing the latest census data. The numbers that we provided in the report are projections based on the 2016 census, but we're also working very closely with our regional plan review team, who have done a lot of modeling and are working very, very closely with Statistics Canada to get that district by district breakdown. So we're hoping to have that as part of phase 2 as well, so we can really nail down those numbers, because that'll be very, very important work when they're looking at moving those boundaries and those types of things.
I also assume we'll be having statistics on the amount of building permits that have been applied for, so we know exactly by civic address where we anticipate more development?
Absolutely. So that's part of the exercise. So our planning group, our regional planning group is working with that, and civic addressing is actually a very major component. They'll be making a presentation to, our civic addressing group will be making a presentation to the District Boundary Resident Review Panel at their June 15th meeting as well too. So that's very much top of mind.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councillor Hensby. Over to District 14, Councillor Blackburn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Mayor. And just sort of follow up on what Councillor Hensby was just saying about population. And, certainly, I don't think anybody doubts that the population of this city has certainly grown by leaps and bounds the last, even the last 5 years. So I think if I'm hearing and reading the report and the recommendations correctly, to ensure sort of an equality of workload among councillors and equality of representation, seems like the current situation can be managed with just boundary adjustments as opposed to adding new councillors. I'm just sort of thinking, for example, Councillor Outhit in District 16, He's gone from Bedford to Bedford West, which has exploded, and that's meant that, his level of the representation, the number of people he represents has, sort of skyrocketed, while ours have, in some cases, have not grown as much, but that type of situation can be managed at this point with boundary adjustments as opposed to just throwing another body at the situation.
Deputy Mayor Lovelace, through to the councillor. I think that this is a complicated exercise. What we have provided to you today is a recommendation based off of the public consultation and with the parameters of the NSUARB's process, or the province's process through the NSUARB, but then also looking at a lot of other important data that was provided to you. What the recommendation for today says is, based on the consultation that occurred over the last few months, based off of the comparator municipalities that we are seeing, based on what we're observing, it seems like the number 16 makes sense. It is ultimately council's application to the NSUARB. So council has to determine if that number is correct and if that is going to be what is the best recommendation moving forward on it. Based on the analysis, that is what the recommendation is today. And then the actual borders, as we said, for phase 2, the resident review panel will be taking the number as it sits and applying whatever that number may be to those questions, concerns, and the important conversations that have happened today about communities of interest and those 5 different parameters set up in this process. So I don't want to give you a non-answer on that, but it's very much a reflection of the process is what we're providing to you today.
All right. No, that's good. That's good. I guess the only other thing that I would raise is, when we look at comparative cities with the same population makeup, I caution that it's not a strict apples to apples comparison, because when it comes to those other jurisdictions, so the other cities, a similar sized city might have only 10 councillors, but guess what? They might have, 2 council support staffers that help manage phone calls, emails, that sort of thing. Whereas, in our case, we have, 4 councillors sharing 1 council support person, in some cases, not always, but so, just putting up the population of the city and saying, here, we compare to them, they have 12 councillors, we have 16, I think that more information needs to be provided, I guess, with that comparison, so it becomes more of an apples to apples comparison. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Well said. Councillor Morris, over to you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Just a small process question. If we, for example, later decided that we needed to add another councillor as an Indigenous representative or something like that, and then we got to 17, how would we break ties and that sort of thing? Because right now, I guess I'm wondering if the number that you're considering would either make or break tie votes at council.
Thanks, Councillor Morris, through the Deputy Mayor, to yourself. From a procedural standpoint, a tie vote is a lost vote. So that is pretty easy to do that component of it. So if there is a tie for any vote, it is considered lost. Having an odd number of representatives on council is something that is considered by many groups. Process-wise, the items requiring legislative change, there will be a process that would have to be followed for that. The province would have to determine that that was a step that they wanted to see moving forward, and there would be a long process to allow and then to enact anything of that nature. So I don't have any firm process on how that would occur, because it's not something that has happened before in this organization and not happened for this group. But from a procedural point, the tie vote is a lost vote is the quick answer to the question.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you so much. I just want to show some appreciation to Ian, Liam, and Margaret, and your team, Margaret, for all of the work that you've done. This is an important decision as we move forward, and thank you, former Councillor Walker, for joining us today. Council, what is your wish? Question has been called. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed? That motion has carried. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to move on to 12.1.2, Councillor Appointment to Appeals Standing Committee. We have a motion in front of us. Does anyone wish to put it on the floor? Councillor Mason.
Sure. If anybody wonders the rapid tippy-tapping of a lot of the councillors, it's because with none of us having been in chambers for 3 months, none of our emails are working, and we're all just watching our computers constantly reboot, so that's why I didn't have the motion right up. So I will move that Executive Standing Committee nominate one member of Council to the Appeals Standing Committee for a term of November 2024. Do we actually have to say who it is, or was it in the in-camera? I forget. If this is a nomination, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, I guess that means that we should open the floor to nominations, or Ian has something?
Mr. Clerk?
Good timing, I guess. So in the report that was provided to you, there are 2 interested councillors for this group. It is a public item because we do these as public items for councillor appointments. So we do have 2 interested councillors, Councillor Purdy and Councillor Daigle-Gammon, to put their names forward for this.
Did we have a seconder on that?
I'll nominate, so I should just nominate somebody and someone can nominate somebody else and we can vote, right? I'll nominate Trish Purdy. Since she's here and because she was first in the emails. And she's great. That's the end of my argument. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Do we have any other nominations? Do we have a seconder for that nomination for Councillor? Thank you, Councillor Blackburn. Mr. Clerk, now that we have 2 nominations on the floor, so we have DeBoggs. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, they seem to be very slow on the response today. I apologize for that. So Krista actually will run this process. We do have this will be for some of you, this will be the first time that you've actually done a vote in person. So this is going to be unique. So Krista has some ballots.
Thank you.
Just as a note, this will be for members of executive. This will not be for any members who are not on executive.
There is official ballot counting taking place at this time. And the member of council to the Appeals Standing Committee for the term to November 2024 is Councillor Daigle-Gammon. Thank you all for that in-chambers vote, in-person vote. Moving on to 12.3, we have members of standing committee. I will say thank you, Councillor Trish Purdy, for putting your name forward. Appreciate that. So none for 12.3, 13 motions. There are none. So next we will move in camera. Thank you, Councillor Hensby. Seconder? Thank you, Councillor Mason. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed? That motion has carried. Council, do we have any other items to move? If you wish to. Do we have a motion to move in camera? Councillor Mason.
Now, I read all these around 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and I already forget the contents. I'm pretty sure they're recommendations, so I'm going to move them and see if we don't have to go in private. See you later, Councillor Russell. So I'm going to move that 14.2, that the Executive Standing Committee adopt the recommendations as outlined in the private confidential staff report dated 2nd May 2022, and direct that staff report dated May 2, 2022 be maintained private and confidential. I so move. Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? Aye. All opposed? That motion has carried. Councillor Mason.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I move that Executive Standing Committee adopt the recommendations as outlined in private confidential staff report dated May 6, 2022, and direct the staff report dated May 6, 2022 be maintained as private and confidential. I so move. Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion has carried. Councillor Blackburn.
Well, I'll continue on this train then. Test the will of committee 14.4. Move that the Executive Standing Committee 1 adopt the recommendations as outlined in the private and confidential staff report dated May 10th, 2022, and 2, direct that the staff report dated May 10th, 2022 be maintained as private and confidential. I so move.
Question has been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? That motion has carried. Councillor Mason.
It's like the most boring radio DJ jock talk. I'll just go back and forth with Lisa with her deep voices, reading motions. You can do the next one. 14.5 is the Executive Standing Committee adopt the recommendations as outlined in private confidential staff report dated May 11th, 2022, and 2, direct the staff report dated May 11th, 2022 be maintained private and confidential. I so move. Question?
And the question has been called. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? That motion has carried. Thank you. Councillor Blackburn.
All right, 14.6, I move that the Executive Standing Committee 1 adopt the recommendations as outlined in the private and confidential staff report dated May 18th, 2022, and 2, direct that the staff report dated May 18th, 2022 be maintained as private and confidential. I so move.
Question has been called. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? That motion has carried. Thank you, April, for joining us today. Good job. Well done. Thank you, councillors. So moving on to 15 added items. There are none that I have received. 16, notice of motion. And there appear to be none. Public participation. There are currently no pre-registered speakers. However, I invite any of our public to join us. Okay. And speak up to 5 minutes. Do we have any other ability to invite people to join us while we're in person? No, no. Okay, not yet, not virtually yet. Okay, committee members, the date of our next meeting is June 27th, 2022. May I have a motion to adjourn, please? Motion has been moved. Thank you, Councillor Morris. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much, and apologies for the beginning of the meeting. There was a little bit of confusion, but thank you. Appreciate it.